Hello, I'm Andy Lazur. I'm a water quality specialist with the University of Maryland Extension, and welcome to this Wednesday water webinar on aquatic plant management in ponds. So to cover this topic, I'm going to briefly talk about pond ecology and the importance of nutrients and nutrient cycling. I'm going to present some of the challenges and common problems that we see, as well as then introduce some of the management strategies that we have to reduce aquatic plant populations. So we have thousands and thousands of ponds in Maryland, and they have different uses, and it's important to understand the use of the pond. Some are used for stormwater management, and the purpose of those ponds are to trap nutrients and sediment from being discharged into our waterways. We use ponds for irrigation. We use ponds for various recreational activities, swimming and fishing. And it's important to understand that use and function of the ponds so that we can develop a strategy on how to manage aquatic plants. It's also important to understand the watershed. The watershed is basically the land area that drains into a pond, and the land uses on the watershed will influence the pond water quality and certainly can influence the plant types and as well as density. So nutrients such as nitrogen and phosphorus, sediments can bring in not only nutrients, but also can add to the turbidity of the pond. And then there could be other chemicals perhaps that are applied to the watershed, could be herbicides, road salts, whatever the case may be. But all these things are going to impact the water quality. And that includes such things as the oxygen levels in the pond, carbon dioxide, the pH, the alkalinity, as well as the nutrients, certainly. So it's important to look at a pond as its own ecosystem. So I want to talk a little bit about basic pond ecology here. And this diagram is showing a lot of different activities going on. But certainly we have nutrients coming in, whatever source, certainly waterfowl and other wildlife, turf fertilizers, whatever the case may be, are adding nutrients to the pond. And all aquatic plants thrive on nutrients as well as sunlight in warmer temperatures. And so what we see here is, this is microscopic plankton or algae essentially, and it thrives again on nutrients. We have other types of algae, that filamentous algae, and then we have a whole host of different types of submerged and emergent type of species here, and they're going to take up the nutrients. And all these plants are continually growing, but they also are dying off. And as they die off, they settle down to the bottom. And there at the bottom, there's beneficial bacteria and a host of other benthic organisms that will feed on that organic material and break it down. However, dependent upon the density of the plant material and other inflows of organic matter, whether it's leaf litter, whatever the case may be, you can see a significant buildup of organic material and sediment. And particularly in older ponds, this kind of presents a big challenge to trying to manage plant populations, because what happens here as this material is being broken down, it's also releasing nutrients back into the water, and then that kind of exacerbates the cycling here. But it is a natural process, certainly. And so heavy plant densities are really what causes this excessive buildup of organic matter. So aquatic plants are great in that they produce oxygen on a daily basis through photosynthesis. And this is a typical cycle that you see during the day. Oxygen tends to be lowest in the early morning hours. You get sunlight, you get photosynthesis, and plants are giving off oxygen. And so tend to see the greatest level of oxygen in the late afternoon hours. And then you have respiration going on throughout the day, but then you don't have the oxygen production. And so the respiration will bring concentration down to a lower level. You can supplement oxygen levels in ponds by using various types of aerators. This is a picture of a surface sprayer, which is basically a motor and a propeller that is agitating the water, increasing that air to water contact, which puts oxygen in water. You could use a bubbler type of system, but it's very important to understand proper placement of the aerator, particularly if you're using a bubbler system. You don't want the bubblers down on the bottom of the pond because it can basically be stirring up mud and the organics and adding nutrients. But aeration can, in certain instances, help break down that organic matter or oxidize that organic matter. But it's not going to cure several feet of organic material, but it can help kind of speed up the process of that being broken down. The other thing that aquatic plants do, they influence the pH cycling in a pond. And it follows pretty much the same pattern as oxygen, tends to be lowest in the morning and highest in the afternoon. And the reason for this is that during photosynthesis, aquatic plants are taking up carbon dioxide, and carbon dioxide acts as an acid in water. So if you remove carbon dioxide, you're actually increasing the pH. When we look at aquatic plants, we have to think about there's benefits, certainly. I mentioned oxygen production, but they also help in erosion control, dampening the waves. They help trap some of the turbidity. And obviously, they're very important in creating habitat for a whole host of different aquatic organisms. But again, on the other side, they can be a negative and have some drawbacks in that not only are they the largest oxygen producer, but they're also the largest oxygen consumer. So if you have a really heavy population of plants, particularly phytoplankton, where it's producing a lot of oxygen during the day, but it's also consuming a lot, and that can lead to some of those early morning fish kills. And then again, they're unsightly. Many pond owners would prefer to have very little plants. They want clear water, but that's not necessarily a good thing because sunlight can go all the way to the bottom and stimulate some aquatic plants. Some of these plants and some of the algae species give off compounds which the fish can absorb. If you're fishing, you could have what's called off flavor. You have odor problems, particularly with some of the algal scums that float on the surface. And then again, interferes with uses, fishing, swimming, whatever the case may be. So looking at the types of plants that we have the floating species here, typically water lilies, duckweed. Then we have the microscopic algae that I've talked about. We have the submerged species, which are rooted on the pond bottom, and emerged species, which are similar, that they're rooted on the bottom, but the plant material is actually above the water surface. And then we have our shoreline or marginal species such as cattail, Phragmites. So again, we talked a little bit about phytoplankton and algae before. The two obviously major types of algae are the phytoplankton in here, and you can see this nice green color. And this is a little device called a Secchi disc, which you lower into the water and you measure the distance when that disc disappears. And that kind of tells you the density of the phytoplankton bloom. And typically in a normal, say, farm fish pond, this disc might disappear, say 18 to 24 inches. If you have a real heavy phytoplankton population, kind of towards the pea soup type of situation, then that disc or your hand, if you were to put it under the surface, may disappear in a few inches. And that's a very heavy bloom, and that's going to produce a lot of oxygen during the day, but you're going to have very low oxygen levels in the morning. Then we also have filamentous algae here, and this is a pretty dense population here, and you can see this little fishing or swimming platform, and obviously this surface coverage is interfering with that desired use. But again, they respond quickly to added nutrients. And we have our floating plants, duckweed, watermeal, water lilies. Those are native species. And again, they respond very quickly to increased nutrient levels. We have introduced and non-native species, invasive species such as water hyacinths that grow extremely fast and are undesirable in Maryland because they can take over. But again, they typically will move with wind action. And one of the management strategies, particularly in a small pond, is allow the wind to blow the duckweed over to one side and then skim it up with, say, maybe a pool skimmer. When this material dies off, it can also create an odor issue. So it's really important to first control your nutrient levels going into the pond to minimize the influx minimize the opportunity for plants, aquatic plants, to utilize those nutrients. Then we have a submerged species. These again are the ones that are rooted in the pond bottom. These tend to have soft stems, very quick to take advantage of nutrients, tend to be more problematic in shallow waters, and that's because of sunlight being able to penetrate down into the leaves to where they can grow. Then we have our marginal species. Here's two examples, Phragmites in maiden cane. Others, of course, would be cattails. And again, these tend to extend out to about 3 foot of depth, and they can quickly spread through rhizomes. So in looking at what we see as the top 10 problem weeds, these are the ones, some of these we've talked about. Filamentous algae, I see a lot of, but I do see, get questions on some of these other species. These are common. Hydrilla is mentioned here, and that's a non-native invasive submerged species. And then we have the potamogetans, or a lot of the different types of pond weeds. And then water lilies. Water lilies, even though they have a beautiful flower, are considered, undesirable by some pond owners because they interfere with swimming or fishing, whatever the case may be. So when we look at different aquatic plant control methods, like many things, the best control method is to try to reduce that nutrient input from the beginning and to limit the nutrient availability for plants. And then another strategy, which we'll talk about, is using other plants, beneficial plants, to kind of rob nutrients away, if you will, from undesirable species. One of the first control methods is mechanical, and this includes physical removal or some sort of barrier, whether a physical barrier or a chemical or a shade agent, a dye essentially, that will shade out the light. So mechanical removal, if you think about it, obviously is labor intensive or machine intensive. There are machines that can remove plants, particularly floating types of plants, that you can hire out. We don't have a lot of options for biological control in Maryland. The triploid or sterile grass carp that other states allow are not allowed in Maryland. There have been some trials and some use of barley straw, but I don't recommend that because it's highly variable. Some instances where we seem to see some benefit, but other cases where we have not seen any benefit. And then, of course, we have our chemical control method, and that's the use of registered aquatic herbicides. And again, this can be a very good tool. If used properly, can be safe and also very effective. So when we look at mechanical control, we have dyes, for example, which are used. These dyes come in different colors, but the principle here is to shade the light out so the light is not penetrating down in the deeper depths of the pond. And then there's actually physical covers. I recently saw an article about using a commercial grade heavy plastic covering small patches of Phragmites and leaving it there for several months so that it would, the heat would kill off the plant and the rhizomes as well. So again, different strategies there. One of the things to think about when using a dye is that if you have any sort of flow through water into the pond, that's not going to work. And it also can influence the natural filtration by the phytoplankton in the pond because you're shading out the phytoplankton and it can no longer take up the nutrients. So what happens sometimes is that you may see a buildup of ammonia in a pond. Dye is used and it can create some stressing factors to fish, for example. Looking at the aquatic herbicides, there's a lot of different products that are available there, and they all work in different ways. Some of them are contact herbicides, meaning that they work on the plant tissue that they come in contact with. Other herbicides are what's called systemic. These are herbicides that are taken up into the tissue and go throughout the plant. And then they work differently. The action or the mode of control is different. Some influence the ability of plants to actually develop tissue. Others interfere with the photosynthetic process, some the respiration process, and others that affect the enzyme activity of the plant. So basically, the plant is not able to grow properly and therefore will die off. And some of the herbicides are what's called broad spectrum, meaning that they will kill different species of plants, and others are very selective. And then it's important to consider how to use herbicides, one of the things that's really first and foremost would be to identify the plant species. Is it one species that's creating an issue, or is it multiple species? Okay, and proper identification is really important because some of these species look alike, and it may be that one herbicide works on only one of those species and not all of them. So it's very important to do that. There'll be a reference of an online resource that is a good way to help identify aquatic plants. It's also important to understand, as I said earlier, the watershed. How is that water being used? What is their flow through the pond? If there's considerable flow through a pond, it's very challenging to use a herbicide because you could impact downstream waters and be responsible for any damage that occurs. So you have to think about that. You also have to think about the withholding and the safety issues of using a herbicide. On the label, you'll get information about that. Some herbicides require that you do not enter the pond or do not have livestock or pets, drink out of it for a certain number of days until that herbicide is broken down. So, and then how long will the herbicide last in the pond, the retention time? So with that information, you can then pick the proper herbicide. And what you want to do if you're trying to treat multiple species is hopefully find a herbicide that will work for all of those species. Then it's required to obtain permits, and so important is to read the label. The label is a wealth of information on not only what sort of precautions need to be taken, what sort of safety, what do you need to have for personal protection equipment. Also, when do you apply the herbicide? What time of year? What water temperatures? How to apply it? That's so important. And then the withholding period. So always read and reread the label. And labels can change over time. You may have used a herbicide once before, had somebody apply a certain herbicide, but that formulation may change due to new research, for example, whatever that case may be. So it's very important that each time a herbicide is used to read the label. It's also important to do some basic water quality testing. And one example of this is alkalinity. Alkalinity is the measure of carbonate bases in the water. You can think of it as kind of the buffering capacity, because if you have high alkalinity, that tends to buffer the pH swings that you see during the day. But at low alkalinity, copper is very toxic to fish. So if you have alkalinity lower than, say, 40 milligrams per liter of parts per million, copper can be very toxic to fish. So you can still use it in waters of low alkalinity, but you probably will have to only treat a small portion of the pond, give that a week or so to kind of die off and the oxygen levels to come back and the copper to be broken down, and then treat another area. Obviously, very important is to look at the weather. You certainly don't want to apply a herbicide before it rains, because that can dilute the formulation and possibly wash it downstream out the drain. So time of day is important as well. Very important is to determine the area of water to treat and the volume. So how do you know how much water an irregular shape pond contains? How much volume is there to treat? Now that's very important, because you don't want to overestimate or underestimate the use of a herbicide. In the one case of underestimating, you may not get the effectiveness of the treatment. In the case of over-applying, you're going to be wasting money. You can do this by different ways, taking multiple measurements of depth and then breaking up the pond, if you will, into different shapes. Say this is a triangular shape. This could be a square shape here, a rectangular shape here. And you can then calculate the surface area and with the depth, you can calculate the volume. So this is very important to do. And then from that information, then you can mix the appropriate amounts and apply the herbicide. And as I mentioned before, you can treat partially. And this allows for the plant material that you treated to die off, the oxygen levels to stabilize over a week or two in between your treatments. Always keep good records. Records are great resource for you to go back to and see, how did you apply a particular herbicide? How effective was it? What time of day, year, etc. And this is, valuable information. And it's also required, certainly, but it's valuable information back to you as the applicator. And then monitor the effectiveness. How well did that treatment work? Do I need to go back and reapply? So all of these steps are very important in not only providing a safe application of herbicides, but an effective application. So as far as application techniques, there's a variety of ways to do that by using, broadcasting. Some of these formulations are granular and they can be broadcasted out by different means. Handheld broadcaster, if it's just on the shoreline, or a broadcaster on a boat, for example. There's sprayers, backpack sprayers, surface sprayers, as you can see here in this lower right picture of a boat application of both shoreline and surface vegetation. But there's also subsurface injection if you're trying to treat submerged plants in very deep waters. So again, with herbicide use, you have to understand that it's going to destroy that habitat by killing off the vegetation, which is going to create an oxygen demand. And as those plants die, they're also going to release nutrients, which then can foster algal blooms or algae populations, whether it's microscopic algae or the filamentous kind. The low oxygen situation is the risk there. So again, consider that partial treatment to spread it out over time to reduce that risk of low oxygen. These are some of the common pond problems that we see. The upper left is a stormwater pond where we have cattails growing around the perimeter of the pond, to where the homeowners in this community, it's difficult when they're sitting on the bench nearby to try to even see the pond. So strategically, if they want to keep a small patch here and there of the cattails, that's fine. But they could, physically have this physically removed or treated with a herbicide and try to maintain that so they can, see the pond and enjoy it. We have a filamentous algae on the bottom left here, very common problem. Here on the upper right, we have a blue-green algae scum that has formed. You can see different colors here. This green is kind of a healthy growing population. We have this white color where the mat is bleached by the sun, and we have others that are darker where they're rotting. In this particular example, not only was it unsightly, but it was giving off an offensive odor. And then obviously we have waterfowl issues with excessive nutrients going into the pond. And again, this is where we certainly want to discourage anybody from feeding the waterfowl. That's just going to encourage them to stay and add more nutrients to the pond. The strategy is to use other plants to reduce the nutrient levels that go into undesirable species. And this is basically following what's called riparian buffers that's used throughout the Chesapeake Bay watershed and other areas where they use forested buffers so that water runs off the land. The nutrients and sediment are being trapped and taken up by the plants before it enters the waterways. And so this principle is basically being applied to ponds where they're planting pond buffers with native plants, shoreline plants, and even plants that go out, 2 or 3 feet into the pond surface. And you can see here, in this case, it's providing a healthy pollinator habitat, but again, it's trapping nutrients and sediments and taking those away from, say, undesirable species in the pond, filamentous algae, whatever the case may be. Another strategy is to use what's called floating wetlands. And here they have rafted plants where the roots are hanging in the water, taking up nutrients. And this, again, is one tool that does provide some help in this respect of taking up nutrients, and again, provides some habitat, pollinator habitat, and some aesthetic value as well. We've produced a publication on this that talks about how to control nutrients into ponds. It has a long list. This is just a quick snapshot of many of the native species that are recommended for aquatic plant use, whether it's pond buffer or in the floating wetlands. And this document talks describes the plant, but then also how large it gets, where it should be planted, and some of the wildlife benefits. So just to review some of the pond management practices, as I mentioned, understand your watershed, understand the nutrients, try to control those, minimize fertilizer use. Any erosion around the pond is adding not only sediment, and that sediment has nutrients in it, plant turf or plant other plants around that. Don't feed the geese. Even in a situation in a community area, picking up pet waste can help reduce nutrient inputs in the pond. And then, look at the pond and monitor what type of aquatic plants you have. A healthy pond is going to have some plants, whether it's phytoplankton or other things. You want some habitat, but again, what you don't want is excessive plant growth to where it's interfering with the use, covering the pond, whatever the case may be. There's a great resource here that's available that helps identify plants, as well as providing some information on control methods. And then from that information, you can just develop a herbicide strategy that makes sense for that particular pond and its uses. You can also not mow to the edge of the pond and leave a little bit of buffer, allow that turf or whatever vegetation to grow. You can certainly use the plant buffers around the pond and in the pond, and this can be done strategically. You could have areas of open access to the pond edge, but then you also have these buffer strips in other areas of the pond. But also remember, you can plant species in the shallow zones. As you see in this photo here, you have some shoreline plants along here, and these can actually go several feet away from the pond. But these plants, this is a juncus, a spike rush that's actually in the water. And again, these are trapping both nutrients and sediment and taking them away from plants that would grow in the pond. And then you can also consider using aeration to help oxidize organic layer that's on the pond bottom. Again, typically you have to have at least several feet of water in order to be able to do this. There's a great resource on Maryland DNR on geese management. And then there's also a wealth of information from other resources here. I encourage you to look at this. Department of Ag has a list of certified applicators. There's also information on the MDE website about discharge of pesticides. They have information on stormwater ponds, etc. And then I mentioned the AquaPlant resource and a couple of fact sheets. So I encourage you to utilize these resources. And if you have any questions, you're welcome to contact me. Thank you.